Last month, I was sitting across from a mid-level diplomat in a quiet Brussels cafe. This is someone who spent, 3 decades at the very heart of the transatlantic alliance. He was showing me a draft of a new European digital safety regulation, and his voice was just filled with this quiet pride. You could tell he was a man who truly believed he was protecting European democracy. To him, all these bureaucratic layers, they were a necessary shield against the chaos and disinformation you see online. But then his phone buzzed. A news alert flashed across the screen. A high-ranking U.S. senator had just proposed a travel ban. But not for a foreign adversary, no. It was for European officials exactly like him, citing threats to American free speech. The shock on his face it was immediate and deep. He looked like someone who had just realized the very shield he'd been polishing was now a target held by his closest ally. It was a bizarre moment. I mean, for nearly 80 years, the West has projected itself as this unified monolith of universal values. Yet here were the two great pillars of that alliance, preparing to block each other's borders over a fundamental disagreement on how to regulate a social media post. The most telling part, though, wasn't his anger. It was the silence that followed. As we sat there, the conversation shifted to a group of engineers he'd visited in Shenzhen just the week before. And while his colleagues in DC and Brussels were exhausting their political lives arguing over the right to speak and the duty to censor, those engineers were showing him a new automated port that could move more cargo in a day than most Western hubs move in a week. That contrast, it just stayed with me. It felt like watching two aging aristocrats in a crumbling mansion screaming at each other over the etiquette of a dinner party while the new owners are already in the driveway with a bulldozer. This speech war isn't a sign of ideological vigor. It's the sound of a civilization turning its formidable energy inward because it has lost the ability to build anything outward. We are watching the West engage in a form of civilizational autophagy, where the system starts attacking its own vital functioning organs.
That story, that image of the diplomat and the engineers, it perfectly sets the stage for this deep dive. Because the mission today is really to analyze this observable shift in global political efficacy. We're looking directly at this transatlantic speech war, this legislative and diplomatic gridlock, not as just, simple policy disagreements. We're seeing them as the primary, most visible symptoms of Western state incapacity. We're going to contrast this internal, sort of self-consuming focus with the rise of results-oriented governance, this pragmatic stability model that's becoming increasingly favored in East and Southeast Asia. So the goal is to extract the concrete political and philosophical insights from this collision. Why is the West so consumed by fighting itself over speech? And what exactly is the rest of the world building while we do? We're focused on extracting those insights from this shift in global efficacy.
Okay, let's unpack this conflict because it's not abstract at all. It's manifesting as actual laws, intense lobbying, and now even proposed visa bans. The flashpoint here, the center of the storm, is the EU's big piece of digital legislation, the Digital Services Act, or the DSA. What is the EU actually trying to do with this law?
So the EU sees the DSA as its central strategy for what it calls establishing a safer, more open digital single market. It's a huge part of its digital sovereignty framework. It was acted in 2022, and it's fundamentally focused on defining user rights and compelling large platforms to be accountable for combating what Europe defines as illegal and harmful content, which includes disinformation. It's a complete overhaul, really.
When you say comprehensive, how large is its scope? Does this apply to, every website, every blog?
It's tiered, but its ambition is enormous. I mean, it covers everything from online marketplaces to social media, even down to basic hosting services. But the obligations, the rules, they scale dramatically with the platform's size and what the EU calls its systemic risk.
And that's where the real hammer comes down, right? The focus on big tech.
Precisely. The strictest rules are targeted at what they define as very large online platforms, or VLOPs, and very large online search engines, VLOECs. These are platforms with over 45 million monthly active users in Europe. So you're talking about the giants. Google search, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, Wikipedia, the list goes on.
So what do these intense requirements look like for a VLOE?
Well, they include mandatory annual risk assessments to identify systemic harms that come from their services. Things like manipulation, promotion of illegal content, or negative impacts on fundamental rights. They also have to get independent audits of their compliance systems. And they have to be totally transparent about their content moderation decisions, their algorithms, even their targeted advertising.
That sounds like a massive regulatory burden. But what does this focus on risk assessment mean in practice for a platform like YouTube, for instance?
For YouTube, it means they can no longer just say, hey, we're a neutral platform. They have to proactively analyze how the recommendation algorithm might amplify certain types of harmful content, let's say health misinformation or hate speech. Then they have to detail the steps they'll take to mitigate that. It completely flips the traditional liability model. The platforms are now responsible for the potential systemic risk their business model creates, not just for reacting to individual illegal posts.
Well, what happens if they don't meet those standards? Because this is where the U.S. lobbying really kicks into high gear.
The penalty structure. That's the mechanism that gives the DSA its global teeth. Non-compliance can result in just massive penalties, up to 6% of a company's annual global turnover.
Global turnover, not just European revenue.
Global. For a major U.S. tech company, that is a figure that can easily run into the billions or even tens of billions of dollars. The size of that fine is the core incentive. It creates this overwhelming pressure for platforms to be not just cautious, but potentially overly cautious, or what critics would call preemptively censoring content, just to avoid the existential financial risk. And this feeds directly into the U.S. critique that the DSA is a censorship threat.
Which brings us to the U.S. accusation this wasn't just some grumbling from Silicon Valley. The U.S. government itself launched a coordinated diplomatic effort against a democratically passed law from an ally.
That's what makes this a geopolitical rift, not just a trade dispute. We saw an aggressive lobbying campaign orchestrated by the U.S. government. They were instructing diplomats to pressure EU officials to repeal or amend the DSA. And even more alarmingly, the U.S. administration was weighing imposing actual sanctions. Specifically, visa restrictions on the European officials responsible for implementing the law. That kind of action, targeting officials in an allied state for passing a law, it's virtually unprecedented. It frames the EU's regulatory power as a hostile act.
And the formal criticism was really solidified in Congress. They didn't just write letters, they published a whole report.
Exactly. The U.S. House Judiciary Committee published a report titled, "The Foreign Censorship Threat: How the European Union's Digital Services Act Compels Global Censorship and Infringes on American Free Speech." This formal inquiry basically transformed the issue from a corporate lobbying effort into a matter of national security interest, a foreign threat to U.S. constitutional rights. And while the loudest voices might be partisan, the official proceedings gave U.S. companies a perfect platform to push back against the EU's authority.
So let's get into the specifics of that critique. Beyond just general regulatory overreach, what are the main claims the U.S. is making about the DSA?
The claims are very specific, and they focus on two things: extraterritoriality and ideological bias. First, the report alleges the DSA compels American platforms to change their worldwide terms of service and content moderation policies to fit EU rules. This creates an extraterritorial regulatory effect. And there's non-public evidence that suggests European regulators explicitly expect this, arguing it's just too expensive for companies to moderate content differently in every country.
So European law effectively becomes global speech policy. What's the second claim, which is even more concerning, about what's actually being taken down?
Second, the U.S. claims that EU enforcement is leading to the censorship of protected political speech. We're talking humor, satire, legitimate debate. Subpoena documents suggest European regulators are trying to suppress core political discourse stuff that isn't even illegal under existing EU or national law. They specifically point to sensitive topics like immigration and environmental debates being targeted for removal.
Which points directly to the ideological bias critics are talking about, that the DSA is being used to silence certain political views.
Right. And the third claim is that private workshops held by the European Commission show a massive overreach in how they interpret key terms in the DSA, expanding its scope far beyond the original text. And finally, the committee concludes the alleged censorship isn't ideologically neutral. They assert that the moderation actions are predominantly and disproportionately aimed at the speech of political conservatives in the United States.
And this is where the core philosophical collision really comes to the surface, isn't it? It's not just about regulation. It's two fundamentally different definitions of what free speech even means in the digital age.
That's the crux of this ideological Berlin Wall.
Yeah.
The U.S. critique is all about the fact that the DSA mandates content moderation. It compels platforms to act. And the U.S. sees that as a direct threat to its maximalist First Amendment tradition, which is almost entirely focused on absolute protection from the state getting involved in speech. The idea is, if the government can't censor you, you are free.
And the EU's perspective is coming from a totally different place. Their view, which is rooted in their Charter of Fundamental Rights, is much more conditional.
It is. For the EU, freedom of expression is not absolute. It has to be balanced against other fundamental rights like human dignity, non-discrimination, and protection from online harm. Their view is that moderation is necessary to protect user safety and dignity. It suggests that, your freedom of expression ends where my freedom from online harassment begins.
Okay, so give us a concrete example of content that really highlights this clash. What would the EU potentially force a platform to remove that the U.S. First Amendment would absolutely protect?
Okay, think about extreme hate speech targeting women or minorities online. Under the U.S. First Amendment, unless that speech directly incites immediate lawless violence or falls into a really narrow category like true threats, it's generally protected political speech. But in Europe, that exact same content could be classified as illegal hate speech or a violation of human dignity under the DSA framework. Now, if a platform operating globally is forced to moderate that content to avoid a 6% global turnover fine from the EU, that content gets suppressed in the U.S. too, regardless of our constitutional protections. That's the conflict in practice.
It sounds like an impossible regulatory position for a global company to be in, and that necessity leads directly to this mechanism known as the Brussels effect. Can you explain the mechanics of how that exports European standards?
The Brussels effect is the term for the EU's ability to basically export its regulations globally just by leveraging its massive market size. The key mechanism is cost versus complexity. Think about it. If a US-based platform were to geo-block content, meaning they block specific content only for users in the EU, they'd have to build these incredibly complex country-specific moderation policies and teams for every single EU member state. It's just prohibitively costly and complicated. The easier, cheaper option is to just implement the strictest EU-required standard globally. That streamlines operations and guarantees compliance. And so the more restrictive European speech standards effectively get implemented on US users, where the First Amendment was supposed to provide maximum protection.
So American speech is effectively being limited by a compliance regime designed in Brussels because it's cheaper for a platform to comply everywhere than to meticulously geo-block. And that's where you see Europe exporting its more restrictive speech standards to the US.
And this ties right back to the U.S. concern that the broad definitions the DSA uses, things like illegal content or disinformation, incentivize platforms toward massive over-removal. They're chilling speech just to avoid those huge fines. The committee report frames the DSA's language like misleading or deceptive content or negative effects on civil discourse as just a pretense for censorship.
But the EU's defense is that they're not targeting political ideas, they're targeting systemic risk. They would argue that when political speech has verifiable falsehoods like climate denial or health misinformation, and it promotes societal harm, their framework requires platforms to act.
That's the key distinction. The EU implicitly rejects the U.S. maximalist faith in the self-regulating marketplace of ideas. They see high-volume disinformation as inevitably leading to a de facto fake truth which destabilizes society. So they see regulatory intervention as necessary to protect the information ecosystem. To them, characterizing this as censorship reflects an interpretation of free speech that just completely fails to account for the real-world harm of unmoderated digital platforms.
Okay, now let's bring in the role of third parties. The non-governmental organizations, or NGOs. This introduces the very charged claim of censorship by proxy. If governments can't censor directly because of constitutional limits, how are these NGOs being used to do the job?
This is one of the most significant and controversial claims in the U.S. critique. The assertion is that governments in the U.S., Europe, and Brazil have leveraged NGOs as instruments of censorship. It's called censorship by proxy because it allegedly allows governments to get around constitutional protections, like the First Amendment, by outsourcing the pressure campaign to a supposedly independent third party.
So what's the mechanism? If the government isn't ordering it directly, how does the money and the influence flow to get the outcome they want?
The alleged mechanism works like this. These NGOs, which often position themselves as non-ideological fact-checkers or disinformation monitors, receive a lot of funding. The claim is that this funding often comes from both government, intelligence, and security agencies, alongside major private philanthropies. Critics always name George Soros's Open Society Foundations, Omidyar, and Craig Newmark philanthropies. The NGO then demands censorship based on their independent reports or fact checks. But critics say these reports often just function to label domestic dissent as misinformation. The platforms, facing massive regulatory pressure from the DSA or political pressure from the White House, then use the NGOs report as a kind of legal shield to justify removing the content. So they're effectively doing the government's bidding without the government ever issuing a direct, constitutionally risky order.
So the NGO creates the fact check, the platform uses it to remove content, and the government avoids the appearance of direct censorship. It's a way to suppress narratives they don't like.
Exactly. The targeted narratives cited are always these sensitive, politically charged topics where the fact-checking essentially promotes one side of a debate. Things like the origins of COVID, vaccine side effects, the Hunter Biden laptop story, the effects of transgender medicine. The underlying strategy is framed as one used by elements of the intelligence community to label domestic dissent as foreign influence or even treasonous, which makes it much easier to justify suppressing it.
This intense ideological clash has now fully translated into direct confrontation. I mean, we're seeing the crumbling of the transatlantic alliance itself. The erosion of trust is the most damaging part. You hear stories about policy advisors, one in Brussels and one in DC, who used to share this vision of a free internet. Now one is drafting regulations to fine American companies, and the other is working on a travel ban. They don't talk about the open internet anymore. They talk about digital sovereignty and ideological containment. The scale of this conflict, it's just astonishing.
And that feeling is supported by concrete diplomatic action. Just last month, the U.S. State Department barred 5 Europeans. This included former EU Commissioner Thierry Breton, who the State Department called the mastermind behind the DSA, and leaders of organizations addressing digital hate. They specifically used U.S. immigration law, visa restrictions, as a tool to target officials for pressuring U.S. tech firms to censor American viewpoints.
This shows the alliance crisis is real. It's not just a debate, it's diplomatic warfare between allies. But how successful is this European pressure in actually changing what American companies do?
The influence is profound because of what you could call the bigger fish problem. Internal documents that Congress subpoenaed and released show that Facebook executives felt intense pressure to comply with some censorship demands to solve a different problem. That problem was the EU ban on their ability to transfer European user data to servers in the United States.
So they trade compliance on speech to get what they want on data.
Exactly. A Facebook vice president was quoted internally telling colleagues to comply with White House demands on content removal because of the bigger fish we have to fry with the administration data flows, etc. It clearly shows that European pressure, leveraging its market power, forces U.S. firms to comply with demands that then ripple globally. This whole conflict just consumes immense political capital. The West, which for a century was the dominant global standard setter, is now just spending all its energy on internal ideological liquidation. It's a perfect example of what you call civilizational autophagy.
So if the West is using 90% of its political energy to argue over speech etiquette, how much is left to deal with the reality of its crumbling infrastructure? This is where the framework of political decay becomes so important. This failure to govern in the physical world is the real cost of the speech war. Let's start with Fukuyama's definition. What exactly is political decay?
Fukuyama defines political decay as the process where institutional structures, which were once effective, just fail to evolve with societal changes. This failure is usually driven by 3 things: the entrenched self-interest of political insiders, what he calls cognitive inertia, or just simple conformism to outdated rules. In essence, the old rules, designed for a different era, prevent the state from taking collective, decisive action today.
And he identifies 3 necessary pillars for a stable modern state.
Yeah.
It's worth reminding ourselves of those.
Right. The 3 pillars are, first, the state itself, meaning a competent executive and administrative capability to exercise power efficiently. Second, the rule of law, which binds the state and ensures fairness. And third, democratic accountability, which ensures the state serves the will of the people. The ideal system needs a powerful state that's also kept in check by both the law and the people.
And Fukuyama argues that the historical development of these pillars is what shaped the modern U.S. state, leading to a structural weakness that maybe Europe doesn't share in the same way.
That's a critical insight. The U.S., unlike nations like France or Germany, developed democracy and strong representative institutions before it established a strong, competent administrative state. Before the late 19th century progressive movement, U.S. political offices were often just handed out based on corruption and patronage, the spoils system. This historical weakness meant that a fundamental distrust in administrative government became baked into the American political psyche. Unlike Europe, which often had a legacy of centralized state capacity, the U.S. inherited this inherent state weakness, which makes effective, nonpartisan administration incredibly difficult today.
And this inherent distrust and structural weakness leads directly to the core problem we're seeing now, the paralysis of vetocracy.
Vetocracy, a term Fukuyama coined, describes a deeply dysfunctional system where the ability to use a veto power is so widespread that it actively prevents decisive collective action. It's the systemic blocking of policy. The sheer number of veto points in the U.S. legislative and regulatory process makes it incredibly difficult to pass or implement any significant project. It leads directly to frustration and decay.
And the U.S. federal system is practically designed for vetocracy. We all know about the presidential veto, but the problem is much, much wider. Where are all these other veto points?
They're everywhere, at every stage. You're talking about individual members of the House, powerful committee chairs in the House and Senate, the committees themselves, which can just bury legislation. Then you have the Senate filibuster, the Senate parliamentarian, the Supreme Court, which can strike down entire laws, and of course, lobbyists. When you look at the financial power of special interests, corporate lobbying is estimated to be 4 times greater than all other lobbying combined. They essentially act as private veto points.
The result of all these vetoes is just staggering institutional failure. I mean, a drastic reduction in the state's ability to actually govern. What does the data say about legislative efficacy?
The data is sobering. It really illustrates the cost. The modern legislative success rate, the percentage of bills introduced that actually become law, has plummeted from around 7% to just 2%. Very few large, forward-looking projects can navigate that minefield of veto points. And the failure is made worse when special interest groups capture political outcomes through what's called repatrimonialization. This is when insiders influence the legislative process to distort taxes, spending, and regulation, effectively capturing the state for their private ends. They write self-conflicting mandates into bureaucratic rules, guaranteeing an agency will move slowly or fail, which benefits the incumbent interests who don't want change.
And you see this reflected in the American bias toward courts and parties, using the judicial process almost as a replacement for competent executive governance. This is adversarial legalism in action.
That tendency means that government actions, or more often, government attempts at action, are just endlessly challenged and delayed through costly, time-consuming lawsuits. Because the state capacity is weak and distrusted, Congress allows private parties to sue in court very liberally. This reliance on judicialization creates massive negative consequences for any large project. Chronic uncertainty, incredible procedural complexity, redundancy in reviews, a total lack of finality, and just prohibitively high transaction costs for simply trying to build something.
This judicialization, combined with the veto points, explains the physical stagnation we see all around us. I read a story recently about an engineer, and it just perfectly sums up this bitter harvest of vetocracy. Arthur, a senior civil engineer in a major American coastal city, has spent the last 15 years of his career trying to repair a single crumbling suspension bridge. He describes his office not as a place of blueprints and steel, but as a mausoleum of environmental impact reports. NEPA reports that are thousands of pages long, public listening sessions that just devolve into shouting matches, and a stack of lawsuits from local interest groups that have effectively frozen the project in time.
Arthur's story is so symbolic of this decay. He isn't fighting technical problems. He's fighting the structural requirements of vetocracy itself. The National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, is a perfect example of a structure designed with good intent that has now been weaponized as a veto point.
How does NEPA specifically allow for this kind of paralysis?
Well, NEPA requires federal agencies to analyze the environmental consequences of major actions. And while that's essential for sustainability, its expansive requirements provide multiple legal avenues for any group, an environmental NGO, a competitor, even a local homeowners association, to file a lawsuit and get an injunction. That halts the project indefinitely until new studies or reports are completed. Arthur is essentially fighting legal inertia created by the system.
And the engineer in the story contrasts this with what he sees happening elsewhere. He says he spends his lunch breaks watching time-lapse videos of projects like the whoosh high-speed rail being built across Indonesia, or the rapid expansion of infrastructure in China's Greater Bay Area. He sees projects that take decades here being completed in 36 months there.
That contrast, decades of arguing versus 3 years of building, that is the verdict on state efficacy. The system is consuming itself. The failure of the state to execute basic administrative functions, like repairing a bridge, reinforces public distrust, which leads to less support for state investment, which just deepens the vicious cycle of decay.
So we've used the term smokescreen. How do the speech wars we talked about in part connect to Arthur's inability to fix a bridge in part 2?
The free speech wars are the ultimate smokescreen for state incapacity. When governments can no longer reliably deliver basic physical security or economic prosperity or social stability, when they can't build a bridge in 15 years, they desperately resort to manufacturing and manipulating ideological conflicts. They mobilize their bases and simulate political relevance by giving the public something abstract and emotional to fight over, like the definition of misinformation or social media etiquette. It distracts everyone from the fundamental underlying failure of institutional capacity to execute real-world projects. So while all the political energy is being burned on the battle over digital censorship, the physical world, bridges, grids, public transit is literally rusting away.
It's a profound exhaustion. It feels like the West is a giant engine idling at red line, just burning all its fuel to stay in the same place while others are already miles down the road. And this contrast is forcing a global reassessment of the Western political model.
That internal struggle in the West, the visa bans, the DSA conflict, the gridlock, it's not happening in a vacuum. The rest of the world is watching, and many are concluding that the Western model is failing the basic test of efficacy. When you look at the East Asian paradigm, the measure of political efficiency is defined very, very differently.
How does East Asia define good governance? Is it about democracy or something else entirely?
It's defined primarily by tangible outcomes, not by process or performative debate. For this paradigm, good governance is the observable ability to solve problems, maintain order, and secure long-term collective advancement. Can you eradicate mass poverty quickly? Can you stay globally competitive? Can you execute massive, complex infrastructure projects in just a few years? If the answer is yes, then the political system, whatever its regime type, is seen as efficient and legitimate.
And this pragmatic efficiency is deeply rooted in the philosophical concept of Asian values, which really came to prominence in the 1990s as a counter-argument to the Western insistence on universal liberal democracy.
That's the intellectual foundation. The core tenets of this ideology emphasize collectivism, social harmony, loyalty and respect for authority, and the explicit subordination of personal freedom to social stability and collective economic prosperity. This worldview, often linked to Confucian traditions, stresses things like filial piety and foregoing your immediate individual interests for the long-term collective good,
which directly contradicts the hyper-individualistic foundation of Western liberalism, where the ultimate value is individual rights, even at the cost of social friction.
Absolutely. The contrast is sharp. Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore's founding father and a key proponent of Asian values, always maintained that a nation's culture determines its fate more than its economics or politics. He said the main object is to have a well-ordered society so that everyone can enjoy their freedoms, but this freedom can only exist in an ordered state, not in a natural state of contention and anarchy. For this philosophical view, order and strong administration are the necessary prerequisites for freedom, not its messy goal.
And what were the specific reasons he gave for prioritizing order, especially in societies with many different ethnic groups?
Lee Kuan Yew argued that many developing nations, especially those with complex multi-ethnic populations like Singapore or Malaysia, just couldn't afford the instability and social fragmentation inherent in confrontational Western-style democracy. He believed that strong, disciplined leadership was essential to prevent ethnic or religious conflict and to focus all the national energy on urgent tasks like economic modernization. In his view, introducing maximal political liberties too early would just lead to fragmentation, corruption, and the collapse of the state.
Now, when we look empirically at Southeast Asia, the data seems to suggest that this focus on order-based efficiency has led to a significant decoupling of governance quality from regime type. What does that decoupling look like?
This is maybe the most significant finding that challenges the Western development model. The evidence in Southeast Asia suggests there's very little systematic correlation between a country's level of democracy and the quality of its governance. Governance, when you measure it by objective indicators like rule of law, government effectiveness, control of corruption, has changed only gradually over the last 2 decades, regardless of changes in formal political institutions like democratization.
So you have states that score high on governance, but low on democratic freedom, which completely undermines the Western premise that democracy is the prerequisite for good governance.
Precisely. Singapore and Brunei, for example, consistently demonstrate high governance capacity, excellent rule of law, highly effective bureaucracy, low corruption, despite being rated low on democracy scores. And conversely, countries that have made significant democratic progress, like Timor-Leste, haven't seen a corresponding improvement in governance quality. They often still struggle with bureaucracy and corruption. The implication is that governance is successfully conceived as a purely technocratic or managerial problem, emphasizing effectiveness through service delivery and infrastructure, which inherently de-emphasizes political liberties.
So this paradigm effectively challenges that foundational Western argument that democracy is the only path to accountability and effective governance. If the trains run on time and the economy is growing, the political mechanism is seen as effective even if dissent is suppressed.
And this has massive implications for global influence. The governance records of established democracies in the region like Indonesia and the Philippines have, in the eyes of regional realists, often been disappointing. This just further undermines the simple argument that political liberalization automatically produces effective governance.
So what does this institutional decay and this comparison mean for someone trying to make a practical choice in the world today? It means people are making strategic decisions based on efficacy. I'm thinking of a story about a young entrepreneur in Bangkok named Somchai. He grew up believing the Western liberal model was the only path, but lately his perspective has shifted toward what he calls political realism. He watches the news from London and San Francisco, the endless ideological battles, the social fragmentation, and compares it to the order-based stability he sees in the East Asian paradigm.
That entrepreneurial decision is a microcosm of the global assessment of civilizational efficacy. Somchai's choice is deeply pragmatic. He looks at Western systems and sees what philosophers like Oswald Spengler termed a Spenglerian winter, a civilization entering a phase of terminal complexity, internal strife, and exhaustion.
And in this story, Somchai decides to pivot his tech startup's expansion away from Western markets, focusing instead on the order-based stability of the East Asian paradigm.
He's prioritizing function over philosophy. He's not looking for a metaphysical democracy defined by endless shouting matches over free speech. He's looking for a city where the trains run on time, the streets are safe at night, and the government can actually execute a 5-year plan with finality. This reflects a deep, pragmatic disenchantment among realists who see the Western model's social fragmentation and institutional decay as liabilities. While the West is preoccupied with what many observers call culture wars, the rest of the world is choosing the East Asian paradigm not out of some ideological love for autocracy, but out of a basic human desire for a stable, functioning society.
This cultural divergence is visible in the most basic public goods, like transit systems. Which brings us to that common comparison of the NYC subway versus systems in Seoul or Tokyo. It's not just about money or engineering, it's about the cultural acceptance of public space.
That contrast highlights a fundamental cultural divide. In the U.S., hyper-individualism often views public transit as a service, often characterized as charity or only for the poor. This attitude contributes to the normalization of antisocial behavior littering, fare evasion, disruption, because there's a lack of collective ownership or shared consequence. The attitude is often one of not giving a damn about shared public property.
So the same hyper-individualism that drives the maximalist speech debate also undermines the collective effort needed to maintain the physical system.
Precisely. Whereas in East Asian culture, order in public spaces is maintained through the primacy of reputation and image. Enforcement relies heavily on social consequences, shame and judgment, as enforcement mechanisms. You don't refrain from littering just because you fear a police ticket, but out of a collective sense of duty and, critically, the fear of being judged heavily, bullied mercilessly by the collective as degenerate. The mechanism of enforcement is reputation.
We should also be careful not to attribute all of this infrastructure success purely to culture, though, especially with transit systems. There's a crucial technical and historical context that's often missed.
That's absolutely true. It's not an entirely fair comparison. Cities like Seoul and Tokyo, having been largely destroyed in war or developed later, often had the critical advantage of rebuilding their transit infrastructure from a fresh start. This allowed for modern top-down planning and the integration of advanced safety standards like full platform barriers right from the design phase. NYC, by stark contrast, faces over 100 years of legacy infrastructure that has been running 247. Large-scale renovations like installing platform doors in over 400 stations are logistically and financially crippling because the system can't be shut down. This legacy challenge just exacerbates the paralysis of autocracy.
Finally, let's look at the geopolitical calculation. If the US and Europe are fighting over visa bans and internal ideological etiquette, where do the nations of Southeast Asia turn for stability and development?
They engage in a highly sophisticated and pragmatic strategy of hedging. They seek extensive cooperation and investment from multiple partners: China, the US, the EU, and Japan. This isn't about ideological alignment, it's an insurance policy. It's a way to maximize investment and maintain their own strategic autonomy. They refuse to be forced into a single camp.
And the key offering from Beijing, which makes it particularly attractive to autocratic leaders in the region, is that non-interference policy.
That is the pivotal distinction. China's appeal is its commitment to non-interference in domestic affairs. Autocratic leaders find the Chinese model attractive because China doesn't impose democratic values or human rights concerns in its dealings, unlike the US or EU. China offers a successful, compelling alternative model of economic transformation, rapid growth, massive infrastructure, without the political liberalization that leaders fear will threaten their grip on power. This just solidifies the view in the region that governance is about effective management and results, not the messy process of Western democracy.
The message is clear. If the West can't offer stability and competence, why would anyone choose the ideological chaos?
The verdict of civilizational efficacy is starkly drawn. What we've synthesized today is the tragic clarity of a civilization, the West locked in a circular, self-consuming struggle over ideological etiquette. This internal combustion is civilizational autophagy, turning formidable energy inward and paralyzing the system.
The DSA conflicts, the visa ban proposal, the weaponization of NGOs, the 15-year bridge project, all of this ideological liquidation is not a sign of democratic health. It's a profound and costly distraction from the fundamental failure to build and maintain order. While American and European elites exhaust their political capital in these metaphysical battles, East Asia is executing multi-generational investments in its physical future.
The central tragedy is the loss of fundamental competence. A civilization that transforms the basic administrative function of managing digital content or repairing a bridge into a stage for endless ideological warfare has already conceded the high ground of efficacy.
Ultimately, what this deep dive shows is a fundamental truth that many Western elites seem to have forgotten. The capacity to govern, to build, and to maintain order is the prerequisite for freedom. It is the stable floor, not its eventual reward. The light from the Leviathan's self-immolating flames illuminates a long twilight for a civilization that has prioritized talking over building.